Hello and welcome to this November 2019 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name is George Miller, and in this programme I'm talking about Americans, their cars, and the law with Sarah Seo, who's a historian of criminal law at the University of Iowa and the author of Policing the Open Road, How Cars Transformed American Freedom. Cars transformed freedom, yes, but it was far from a straightforward transformation. In the past century or so, during which the automobile has become the preeminent means of transport, over 3.6 million people have been killed on the US's roads. In its first decades, cars caused such chaos on the roads that many new laws had to be enacted, which in turn required new methods of enforcement. But with so many drivers, so many infractions, law enforcement has always struggled to keep up. Thus the arguments about racial discrimination in how traffic law is applied, and regular appeals to the Supreme Court under the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. I noticed that Sarah mentioned in her profile that she was intrigued by the why questions of history. So when I spoke to her on the phone recently, I began by asking her about the why question that had sparked her interest in American drivers and the law.
So there were actually several why questions that popped in my head when I first started this project. One is a question that came up when I was a federal law clerk for a judge in New York City. And she was going over the Fourth Amendment, and she said, the Fourth Amendment is an area of law that changes every year. The Supreme Court hears a Fourth Amendment case about cars seemingly every year. And one year they decide whether the police can search the trunk. The next year they decide whether they can search the glove compartment. The next year they decide whether the police can search a purse in the back seat of a car. And I found this very odd because the U.S. Supreme Court is the highest court in the country, and they decide questions of importance. They don't decide every case, and so they choose the cases they want to decide. And so the question is, why is the nation's highest court deciding these seemingly factually nuanced, trivial cases every year? And so that was one why question that I had. Another why question that I had pretty early on in my research was I looked up every Fourth Amendment case that was decided from the ratification of the Fourth Amendment in the 18th century. And the number of Fourth Amendment cases were pretty small in the first century. Some decades, there were no Fourth Amendment cases. And all of a sudden, the number of Fourth Amendment cases exploded in the early 20th century, specifically around the 1920s. And so that was another why question. What happened in the 1920s, and why was the Fourth Amendment suddenly so controversial and contentious?
So to you as a historian and a legal scholar, you were looking then at what changed in society, and the answer you came up with was the motor car.
Exactly. One response to that question is exactly the motor car. What happened in the 1920s, that was when American society was first becoming a mass-produced automotive society.
Can you just sort of sketch a picture of what kind of, I know this is a big question, but sort of the degree of social change before we get on to the sort of the more legal questions, but the sort of degree of social change that the motor car was causing in the 1920s?
It changed almost every aspect of American society, starting from the get-go, from how people lived. The mass-produced cars made possible suburban neighborhoods that were some quite a distance away from centers of business. It thoroughly changed American culture in terms of how young people were courting each other. Instead of being courted at the parlor of the family home, they were able to go for a drive and have some sort of privacy. It changed how families spent their Sunday afternoons. Ministers of churches complained that families stopped coming to church because they were going for Sunday drives, which is a thing in the 20th century. So from culture to business to how people lived, how they carried on their errands, all of that changed. And you see that reflected in American culture, in songs, in literature, in poetry, in films, and advertisements. The change was transformative at every level of society. And my book covers one part of that transformation, which is the relationship between individuals and the state, specifically its police officials.
Because I guess one narrative that we're probably all quite familiar with is, and you've already said, the car as agent of freedom. And we've kind of maybe got a rather rose-tinted view of the automobile as this sort of great enabler of freedom. But what your studies and what your book make clear is this sort of profound redrawing of the relationship between individual and the state, and how the state expresses its will through the law and enforces it through law enforcement. So can you tell me what was the nature of the challenge there? What did lawmakers in the early 20th century have to grapple with when the automobile came along?
So there was this phrase that came up frequently, which is the danger of too much liberty. Cars gave too much liberty, which created chaos in American society. And by that, what the officials meant was people did think of driving their cars as increasing their self-determination and their individual autonomy. But when everybody did that in these mass-produced cars, it created traffic congestion. It created also traffic accidents. Children were dying on the streets. Pedestrians, even if people who weren't in cars, they were just walking on the sidewalks, they were at risk of being run over by a speeding car. And so to meet the challenge of the chaos that these hundreds of thousands of cars suddenly on streets that were not prepared for them, what officials did was to enact traffic laws. And every year, these traffic codes became larger and larger and larger. And suddenly, the problem was not just how do we confront the public safety issues, but it was the accompanying problem was how do we enforce all of these laws when people kept breaking them? So it became an enforcement problem.
Because as you point out, you suddenly have a proliferation of new laws, and you have a proliferation of potential and actual new lawbreakers. So it's not just simply bringing in new legislation, it's trying to work out what to do in order to make the road safe and implement this law. And that, from what you've written and what you've said, it seems as though that's always been a challenge. That there's never been a time when law enforcement has been equal to the task of enforcing the law.
Exactly. And what I found very interesting after I've done most of the research for my book and started writing it, actually, just reading the newspapers today, I started seeing common themes that I saw 100 years ago about the challenges of enforcing traffic laws. And some of what was eye-opening to me was some of the responses to the challenges today were already tried 100 years ago. So I saw this repeat of history that I found fascinating.
I guess the two options, which are not mutually exclusive, given this challenge of enforcing a body of law with a very large, potential population of people who are infringing the law, is to look for technological solutions, and you think about things like cameras, or to introduce some element of discretion in the enforcement of the law. And both of those are clearly problematic in different ways. I wondered if you could say a little bit about why each of them throws up problems.
Sure. So today we have the advantages of technology to enforce traffic laws, including speed cameras and red light cameras. And the benefits of traffic cameras include the ability to enforce traffic laws on every driver, right? Everybody who goes above the speed limit can get ticketed. Everybody who runs a red light can get ticketed. So the enforcement is near 100%. The cons of traffic camera enforcement is that there could be mistakes. in the enforcement, whether there's technical glitches in the enforcement, or perhaps if the custom is to go 5 miles over the speed limit, but the traffic camera enforces on everybody who speeds even a mile over the speed limit, right? And so it's hard to challenge mistakes that cameras may make, and it's hard to take into account instances where there might be a good reason not to enforce the law in that particular instance. So there's a lack of discretion involved in passing judgment.
And therefore, given what you've said, there's a lack of public consent to that form of policing, isn't there? And you say in your article that an increasing number of states in the US are withdrawing their cameras as a way of enforcing traffic law.
Exactly. And one of the main criticisms that I've gleaned from reading about this issue is that people want to be able to challenge a traffic ticket generated by a traffic camera. But it's really hard to challenge such a ticket. Either the procedures are really arcane, or the bureaucratic rigmarole is too difficult, or if the camera takes a picture, it could be a picture could actually capture an ambiguous situation, but the bureaucracy can say a picture is a picture, and so the lack of procedures to challenge has become one of the main criticisms of traffic cameras.
So what about now if we turn to the other way of applying the law, which is in this situation where there's not sufficient personnel to apply it rigorously everywhere at all times, this idea of applying the some discretion in enforcement of the law?
Right. So the issues presented with human enforcers of traffic laws is that there will never be a sufficient number to be able to enforce the laws 100%. And so there necessarily has to be selective enforcement of the laws. And so with selective enforcement comes the power to discriminate which speeders an officer will pull over. And in the history and in American history, the selective enforcement of traffic laws has been used to harass minority drivers on the road. So that's a big issue that's been present in American society, and we have a term for that. That's driving while black. But on the other side, discretion, when legal scholars analyze that concept, discretion, today we tend to associate discretion with discrimination, right? If an official has discretionary authority, then that is the authority to discriminate. But what the history of cars and the police showed me, which was surprising to me, was discretion also has positive uses. The power to exert discretionary authority is also the power to show leniency, to be able to extend mercy, I guess is another way to think about it, right? If a human officer pulls somebody over and the driver says, "I was speeding, officer, because I'm driving my wife to the hospital," and the officer can exercise discretion in that situation and say, "You were violating the speeding laws, but in this situation, I'm going to let you go because you're in an emergency." So discretion can be used for both positive uses and negative uses. And so what we're seeing is people who have complained about traffic cameras are really wanting to experience the positive uses of discretion. But the concern is, if they get rid of traffic cameras, in order to enforce the traffic laws, they have to compensate in some other way, and that has been through hiring more traffic officers. Then the trade-off is, with more human officers enforcing traffic laws, and we have the same, we get into the same cycle of the problem of the bad uses of discrimination on the road.
Looking at it from the outside, it does seem as though those kind of, the cop pulls someone over, it is an potentially emotionally volatile situation. The potential for escalation does seem to be in that encounter, again and again, we see instances where violence may be meted out by an enforcement officer.
Yes, exactly. And this is something that I discuss more in my book, which wasn't talked about or discussed in the article, which is the expansion of the police's power beyond the context of the automobile. The police's power grew throughout the 20th century. And the justifications for expanding the police's power, even if it didn't have to do anything with cars, always went back to the car context. One of the cases I talk about in my book is the power of police officers to search an individual after an arrest. And there's a case in the 1970s that expanded the officer's power to search a person as an incident to an arrest. And it's a doctrine, search incident to arrest. That has nothing to do with cars per se, right? Somebody can be arrested at their home, at their office, on the street. It doesn't have to be, during a traffic stop. But this is why looking at cars was so important. That case where that power was expanded happened during a traffic stop. And the justifications used to expand the police's power had to do with the dangers when pulling people over in their car. And so the judges accepted that justification, and therefore we have a doctrine, search incident to arrest, that is much larger than it was 100 years ago.
Now, I know the law doesn't like ambiguity, but I was thinking, is the problem in terms of society that the car occupies a sort of strangely ambiguous place between the private and the public? We feel it's our private realm, but there we are out on the public highway. Perhaps we're doing something which infringes the law. And in that ambiguity is a tension that can lead to problems.
That is one of the key tensions, this ambiguity of the car as both a public property that's regulated for the public's interest and private property. Everybody thinks of their car, my private place. And it's that tension that has made it so difficult for courts to articulate clear rules governing the police and citizens in cars. And that's why, and going back to the why question that, motivated my research, why does the Supreme Court decide a car case every year? The past few years, they've decided 2 or 3 car cases a year. Why? Because of the ambiguities arising from the tension between public and private when it comes to cars.
And maybe I can ask you in conclusion, Sarah. I mean, if one were a sort of techno-optimist, one might think, well, self-driving cars are going to remove all the legal problems and defuse these situations and stop accidents happening. But I guess even the most optimistic would have to envisage quite a long transition period where all sorts of different types of vehicles are on the road. And in fact, we see new legal problems thrown up rather than the elimination of legal problems relating to cars. Exactly.
The old questions might go away, right? Right now, the problem is that because the police can stop anybody for a traffic violation, they can pretty much choose who they want to pull over. That problem might disappear with self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars are programmed to never violate traffic laws. And so that initial justification to pull over cars might disappear. So that old problem might disappear, but you're right, new problems will arise. There's new questions about the tensions between public and private, even with autonomous cars. One example is, these autonomous cars are basically operated by a computer that's connected to a data service some distance away, connected or speaking to the clouds, right? And because our data in autonomous cars are made public to some third-party company, courts have held that there's no privacy expectation in those situations. So even with the privacy of a self-driving car, you have that public-private tension. Is what is public when the data coming out of the car is shared with all these different private companies? Is there a privacy expectation in that situation? And so these are the new problems that modern technologies are raising. I was talking to Sarah Seo about her article, Price of Freedom on the Road,
which is in the November 2019 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's also available on the website at mondediplo.com. Sarah's book, Policing the Open Road, How Cars Transformed American Freedom, was published by Harvard University Press earlier this year. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.